The new Leica M10R finally provides everything people wished for in a compact rangefinder format. And it also seems that the newly developed 40 megapixel sensor, probably developed aligned with the sensor in the new M10 Mono, is dealing much better with heat coming from longer exposures and high ISO values. And I did a couple of reviews already on that new camera. I post the links down below in the info box so you can look them up. What I'm going to explore in this video is how the camera reacts to higher ISO values, and the ISO range goes up to 50,000, which is something we've seen before on Leica cameras. But my conclusion, right anticipating at the beginning of the video, this camera can see in the dark in the same way as the new Leica M10 Mono, where you can also find a review on its high ISO behavior on my channel. When we arrived at the location, it was pitch black night. Hardly anything recognizable. The moon was already going down at the horizon, but the camera could see everything in front of me very well, and that's why I'm saying in the same way as the M10 Mono, the new M10R can actually see in the dark. I mean, if you look around the camera, everything pitch black, and the camera with a higher ISO value of 6400 could just see everything as if it would be daylight, and that's really amazing. But what interested me most, of course, playing with ISO values and coming to results in a moment, how is the noise behavior of that newly developed sensor. Starting with the extreme, I set the ISO to 50,000, which is the max you can get on the Leica M10R, and took a 4-second exposure. Of course, the image is completely overblown in terms of light, but I just wanted to test. And here's a remark which I think is important. There is a lot of technical stuff discussed in the community, but at the very end, it's always about getting to know an individual camera and an individual sensor, and that can best be done by just trying out and pushing the camera to the limits what's possible with a new sensor, because different cameras with different sensors will have different behavior with respect to ISO and noise, despite all the technology discussions we sometimes have in the community. So I wanted to stick for a moment to an ISO of 50,000, as said before, to push the limits. And this is now a 1-second exposure. Is not as overblown as the last one we saw. And with a little bit of post-processing, you can convert or turn this image into the following. And this looks pretty much acceptable. And if you check in your own experience, using an image with an ISO of 50,000 is hardly possible on any camera. Typically, these images are completely noisy, they have a lot of grain, they are not usable. But here, shooting with 50,000 ISO at a 1-second exposure time actually produced a quite usable image, and I only spent about 5 minutes in post-processing, so you probably can even squeeze out more of that image. Going to the other extreme, you see here now an image taken with an ISO of 200, so ISO 100 was not successful at all, but ISO 200 worked. Of course, I needed a much longer exposure time here at 16 seconds. I come to the disadvantage of that setup in a moment, and you see on the left-hand side here, before post-processing, so that's the digital negative, and you see on the right hand side what you can squeeze out of the image. And maybe looking at the night sky first, so clearly you have here a very clean image, so there is absolutely no noise recognizable, looks really good, and you have a lot of details in that image. You even see the structure of the forest. In the original image as it came out of the camera, everything is dark, but then you can get the structure back, and that's a typical property of dynamic range. And my impressions after about 2 or 3 weeks is that the Leica M10R has actually excellent dynamic range. clearly the longer exposure time at 16 seconds has one big disadvantage, and that's that the stars become little dashes. So if I zoom in here, I see clearly that the stars are no longer pinpoint sharp spots, but they are little lines, which comes from Earth rotation, and that's a disadvantage if you go up here to a 16-second exposure time, which can be fixed now by interpolating between the two extremes, very high ISO and 1 second exposure, and an ISO of 200, which is very low, with a 16-second exposure, and that's what we are going to look at next. So a typical ISO for night sky photography is 3200, or like we have it here, 6400, and this image clearly is overexposed at 8 seconds. So we can actually try now to get back details out of the highlights in the same way as we saw before, to get details in terms of structure of trees and forest out of the shadows. So after a couple of minutes in post, I got the following image, and you see now that the structure on the sky speck is still overexposed for my taste, and let's appear that lake here as if it would be daylight, which again is amazing what the camera sensor is capable of doing here. But you get the stars back, you get structure back, is not as badly overexposed as it came out of camera, and clearly I could invest more time to actually get this in an even better look. Now the best is yet to come. Let's move on to a different setting. So quickly another look here. I changed my perspective for a bit more night sky, a bit less of the lake, ISO 640, 12 seconds. This is the image as it came out of the camera without any post-processing. And here is the image after post-processing. Again, looks very good, very clean. But unfortunately still the stars are tiny little dashes. So 12 seconds for that full frame sensor with the 35mm Summicron was still too long to actually get the stars as dots. Here's another example, ISO 800 this time, excellent noise behavior as recognized before. 4-second exposure this time, so clearly here the stars are no longer dashing. This is very short, and in this way I played with different settings and later in post played with the images just to get to know that new camera sensor, because as I said before, at the very end you need to gain experience with your new equipment, your new gear, to have the right settings in a situation where it is really required. I also changed location and did a shooting over the lake. This is outside of Zurich, towards Zurich, across the lake, along the lake. And this is an image taken with an ISO of 400, 24 seconds, because here I was not so much keen in the stars, but I wanted to get the lights on the shore of the lake. Pretty nice actually, left-hand side before, right-hand side after. And here's another one now from the same scene, but with an ISO of 1600, and in the same way is providing a good, clear, crisp, clean image. At the very end, I can confirm what I indicated in my first couple of videos on my channel on the Leica M10R. It has very good noise behavior. I'm very happy to see what I see. It has excellent dynamic range, and in addition it has a 40 megapixel high resolution, so you have a lot of reserves if you want to crop into an image or go for large prints. Don't forget to drop me your thumbs up and stay tuned on my channel. There is new content coming every week. Thanks for watching, stay safe and healthy, happy shooting of course, and peace out.